I say no. Disrespect the 3, disrespect the true rating, and deal with it another way. Just have it snap to the 0 reaction if that's all the writer's written, and maybe for good reason. I don't think people really exist in infinite, stages of gray. Hi, I am Demon Dev, and lately something that's been on my mind or put into my mind by a lot of other people that I talk to about the Electro system is people feel very convinced that emotional, social systems are anything but systems, that they're kind of random, that they don't follow consistent enough laws or rules to be systematized both accurately or in an enjoyable way. I completely disagree, and I would love to get into some of the kind of fun design and theory aspects that have led me to this conclusion. Um, at the heart of it is a couple things, but one of them is emotional numbers. Okay, so we get that, with other people, we have feelings and emotions, reactions to things you could say or not. Let's get very specific and keep within the realm of dialogue choice within, a game. So, in order to have right and wrong choices that are not just arbitrarily determined by the writer, you have to figure out a lot of things. The first thing you have to figure out is the components that like a sentence or a dialogue choice can be broken up into. Typically, this is just kind of designed, you could say, by the writer. So the writer has option A and option B, and both of those will have different, corresponding outcomes for the AI. And even if there's a little bit of a calculation going, let me do it R. Even if there's a little bit of a calculation going on. So if let me make this full, much better. It might just be, some relationship value. Even if you're doing that, the fact of whether you're picking A or B fundamentally determines the outcome. So how do we pull out a property of A or B? And this has to be, let's see, what is it, K? This has to be something that's shared and consistent across the board. So if they don't share the same, I guess you could say, maybe if X is a property of A or B, it's a shared type of component. So if you assign that, then you're starting to get a system with fairness, with rules. So okay, so the A's X, B's X, maybe A's X equals good on something and B's X equals bad on something. Okay, fair enough. And it's up to the game designer to decide what happens next. And I think most people accept that. But the fundamental branching is still happening within A or B. So you may know that the properties of A or B are appealing or not appealing, but ultimately your interpretation is circling the writer's decision. The writer is, it's going to be picking which option they want to succeed in whatever metric. If you want failure, then it would be the other option. But the writer is going to determine whether A is correct. So in order to break away from the system, and in order for the shared type X to matter at all, what do? Well, you have to go a level deeper. Let's go a little lighter. You have to combine this, this choice, this A and B choice, to exist within the same system. They need to have some sort of a shared process in order to make it fair. Otherwise, it's completely arbitrary whether it mattered, whatever the interpreted properties of these things were. So once you do that, then, the outcome, the formula matters. Anyways, that's kind of the basic idea. So what is the big complaint that a lot of people have about what I'm trying to do here? Well, they fundamentally think that relationships and, especially complex situations are just super vague. Which is not a weird thing to think. I think we've all been in situations, certainly myself included, where you have no idea what happened. Let's stay more specific and say, okay, within a situation in which you ask out a girl on a date, maybe there was a lot of things going on that made you come to the conclusion she likes me. And you think, okay, good chance she'll go out with me. And then from that, you decide your plan of attack. Ask her out. Okay, pretty reasonable thing. Maybe A is she spends a lot of time, lots of time on the clock, and like one-on-one time, she's choosing to hang out with you a lot. Maybe 2, she makes flirty comments, winky face, really creepy winky face. And maybe 3, maybe you just have this feeling, mystery feeling, but you've got a hunch. Okay, all perfectly possible, but what happens next makes it feel like there's some sort of randomness go on, because maybe she says no. Now, this is complicated because, of course, the girl in this situation is an actor with her own agency. She's, of course, allowed to say no, and all of this could actually be completely accurate. This could all be accurate, and she could say no for a million more variables. Now, let's say this is, this is the calculation point. This is the big deal. This is you asking her out. So what do we do here? So what happens here? Basically, you have to come to one of 2 conclusions related to game design, or, I don't know, philosophical takeaways. The first conclusion is that there are so many variables that it's essentially random. You can't know them. You can't know the weighting. You can't know the prioritization. And you can't even know the fluctuation of all those variables on a day-to-day or even hourly basis. Too confusing. Might as well summarize the whole experience as random. Compelling case. The second choice is you can say, well, yes, there are a lot of variables, but it's not random. There is a, personalized to each person and their personality. There are, a list of things, there are a list of things, and they actually can be simplified into something, where you get an educated guess. You can be somewhat confident about, what you think is important to the person, at least in hindsight, makes sense in hindsight, I think is really the big stopping point here. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person that you ask out and rejects you, that's not necessarily saying that they are a reliable narrator. Most of us are not reliable narrators. Nope. Okay, so what do we do with these two conclusions? Well, this is the fundamental conflict here. So most people, especially when you're trying to model a game system, are basically saying something, well, because there's so many variables, it's practically random. Maybe they throw in some different weights, some, different, more simplistic, like diplomacy, if it's like any political operations, allies, enemies, or maybe just like, dislike, or, maybe there's some sort of a vengeance thing. These are relatively, overarching ideas that are, maybe not weighing into as heavily in the bit by bit interaction. But nothing about these variables is usually that clearly communicated to the player. And when it is communicated to the player and, in some sort of different bars, maybe there's an alliance, different bars like that, even when it's communicated to the players, they typically have no idea how that relates to the formula, how it relates to the reaction formula. What are all the factors? What are all the weights? Not only do they not understand how it relates, but typically they're just given R1 or R2 as the reaction from all the stuff. They just get a reaction, and they really don't know whether there was multiple options or not. So a lot of people who disagree with the way my system works, especially, but a lot of people even have no idea of me, think that because of that complexity, build in the complexity, but you might as well also include random chance. So maybe, A is plus or minus, 10%, as a variable, and all of them do this. And they think that simulates real life because there is a lot of uncertainty in real life. My approach is no, there's no need for random chance. Just keep adding the variables, the most meaningful variables that you think, should apply, and then make them universalized and consistent. With enough variables and complexity, you still get the overall uncertainty, but it's fair uncertainty. So if the player is clever enough or learns the system, then they can get to that educated guess, hotspot, I would say. So that's what my system does is, you've got your options, and they have consistent properties, plus bond, minus bond. You've got the AI's calculation takes those into account. So this would be, bond plus A or something like that. And you see that happen on screen. You start out at a rating on a 0 to 10 scale at a 5. And then that bond, if it's a plus option, goes up to a 7. If it's a bond down option, it goes down to a 3. And from there, the writer then gets to be arbitrary. And arbitrary feels like a negative term, but it just means that it's hard to fairly systematize the way that it works. And systematize just means like generated in a way that, the game is in control of. Fundamentally, when you have writers writing things, the game is not in control of those. And there's a lot of pros to that. You can go a lot more complicated and more nuanced and push a very strong, feeling arc moment with the writer having creative control. So what do we do with this 3 number? So here we get into more of the emotional numbers. So for me, when I calculate this rating, this is a problem that a lot of programmers face. What do you do with this number? Even if you feel like you've masterminded the formula for calculating a reaction to something the player does, what do you do with the rating that you come out of it? Because unless you can attach it to a systemically relevant outcome, unless it matches some sort of content that you've got ready or it can generate. It doesn't matter. And a lot of people, you can kind of straddle the fence on this and say, okay, well, we've got a 3 and maybe we've got a content that matches up with 0 or 10. A very hard break here. So we're going to choose this one. Now there's a difference of 3 to 0, but maybe the rating of 3 is what determines, her reactions to you. In this way, I would say 3 in this rating calculation is a pure representation of how she's feeling. So, when she's reacting to you, she's taking into account all the factors that the game can handle that you've put into the game for these moments. And the AI is arriving at a value of 3 out of 10. So to me, that represents, her true, being. Internally, she's frustrated, depending on the context. So when you go from a 3 to, okay, the closest content I have to match that 3 is a 0, what I think happens, I think you should allow that to happen. I think that's really cool. What I think happens is the AI character or just the person is unable to express themselves, to find words to express a nuanced negative reaction. It's like if somebody asks you out and you want to say no, you may not be looking for a way to say no in a 0 out of 10 way. Maybe you feel a little bit bad, but maybe the only words you can come up with are, you should know that I was never going to say yes, or something like that. That's super crushing. There's not many ways to make a rejection not crushing to begin with. So, maybe that would make sense. And so these differences between 3 and 0, I think, should be embraced by the writers and by game developers. I think there's a great frustration, and that ties back into the randomness in which, okay, if you've got such complex factors, they all need to be accounted for. They all need to make their way into the end product. And the only possible way to, that a lot of people come to the conclusion of, the only possible way you can handle that is if you have generated content. So if she reacts at a 3, the game needs to find a way to segment up her reactions to enough resolution, to enough reactive resolution that that 3 is respected. I say no. Disrespect the 3, disrespect the true rating, and deal with it another way. Just have it snap to the 0 reaction, if that's all the writer's written, and maybe for good reason. I don't think people really exist in infinite, stages of gray. I think we exist in, a much more blocky breakdown. In any one moment, we have limited time to react, and we choose from, at best, maybe 2 or 3 options. I think most of the time, we've got 2. I think most of us in situations of great conflict maybe can imagine two options, outrage or trying to be patient sometimes. So because of this frustration, because of I say the programmer, I have a lot of beef with programmers. I am a programmer. I say this with love. A lot of programmers get frustrated by how beautiful the numbers are, the data they've arrived to. They've simulated something really real, which is an emotional calculation that takes into a lot of factors, even if they're introducing random, which I disagree with. I'm not a fan of random, especially with deeply complex systems, but there's plenty of places to pull variables to arrive at that complexity. They get these, super complicated these data points, and they're frustrated by the limitations of their silly writers. They can't make enough content to fill this, so there needs to be some sort of hybrid approach or just full on AI, machine learning, what have you, text analysis to generate more options to match the insane levels of complexity, the richness of the numbers here. So I think that's a very cool mission. I think it's inspiring, but I think it's not meaningful. I think the most important thing is to respect the characters you're interacting with, not giving them and giving a character infinite reactivity, in a sense, to what the player says and the very minutia of exactly where the numbers are. You could easily break this down not just to a integer 1 to 10, but to, many decimal places. So maybe her reaction is more like a 3.157. And with computer generated systems, you can easily attach content that is massively segmented into so many reactions, maybe 50 or 100 or hundreds. You can do that. Obviously, we know that there's a big cost. The more generated the system, the less personalized and usually the less specific or rich the interaction. Writing compelling dialogue between characters is really hard, even in traditional mediums, let alone reactively to infinitely many storylines, depending on how many choices and how meaningful you want the choices to be. So that's really tough, and I respect the struggle and the mission that a lot of, I think, programmers are on to take the infinite possibilities and complexity and sometimes randomness and try to attach something meaningful. I think they've jumped the gun, though. I think you can have meaning even with, you could call it data compression. Humans have, essentially infinite complexity in the number of variables or influences that we act on, that we act upon, that we act upon, that act on us. But at the end of the day, we still have to choose to do things. There may be infinite complexity in our heads, but we might still, go out and get a coffee. Getting a coffee, you could, in a way, you could say that is an extremely compressed action. A little coffee here. It's a hot one. It's extremely compressed decision to come out of infinite factors. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you want to buy something. Maybe you want to taste something good. Maybe you want to get out of the house. Maybe you want to, get into an atmosphere. Coffee shops do have that sometimes. All of that gets compressed, I think, into a coffee buying decision. And this could exist on a spectrum. Aha. You could go back to bed. You could get some coffee. You could take a shower, maybe. And okay, yes, there are infinitely many options that are possible that a computer system can extract from, the realm of possible human actions. But you are not a computer. You're a person. And as a person that is tired and wants to leave the house, I guess leaving would, all of these ignore some factors, I think. Maybe the coffee is chosen because it's most aligned to all of these, but tiredness, you're moving against your tiredness in order to seek out a coffee. That takes work. Anyways, you are a person, not a computer. What that means is you do not see the set of all possible options. You think sleep, coffee, shower. And because you think that, there is compression. You're compressing your infinite emotions. Effectively infinite. Effectively infinite emotions are being compressed down into one of three choices: R1, R2, R3. And this is a desirable system to emulate. trying to break up these actions. Again, I'm gonna have to dock programmers a few points on this one, I think. Trying to break up these actions into, maybe like 20 actions degrades the meaningfulness of the choice. When you get into a certain level of grayness, maybe somehow you're sorting on on a scale of 0 to 10. Maybe you might say, oh, what's the metric that sorts for 0 to 10? But that actually is possible. You can derive a metric from a metric. For a while, when I was really in the rabbit hole of, being a programmer and doing what programmers do, which is getting excited by systems, I think. You can make a metric for metric. So, okay, what's the metric that leads to the coffee being chosen? Well, maybe it's a complex like pleasure, restlessness metric that takes into account A plus B plus C minus D, maybe E. Who knows? All these different factors, it takes them into account. But how do you choose this formula that is greatly oversimplifying? Well, you can do a metric for metrics. Ooh. I'm sorry. I think I'm potentially leading programmers down the same path that I once did. But you could say, well, how do you choose the reaction metric? It's going to be a reaction metric on a 0 to 10. Let's break it up into just 4 options. Got pleasure, restlessness. Maybe we've got anger and relief. Using R's there is going to be a little bit confusing. You could have motivation and I keep coming with R words and results. You could have desire and aesthetics. Who knows? Anyways, this you could put on a 0 to 10 scale, and this could take in other factors, in the environment. Maybe Z is equal to some environmental variable, like it's a nice day out. And that will massively overwhelm all the factors. You could have a metrics that's like, what's important to do, what's your task list, what are you supposed to be doing, and it could be completely overridden by it being a nice day out. And that will, so obviously you could do metrics of metrics. But let's not do that. I've already run the risk way too hard of inspiring people to go down a wrong route. I think there's plenty to do over here. Let's stay over here. So anyways, we don't want to break up just because we have, effectively infinite source variables to draw from. We don't want to break up the possible actions that an AI chooses into so many gray areas, because it should be a impactful choice that feels like it's connected to, a more understandable position. Maybe only in hindsight. Maybe you can't predict what's going on in the AI's head, but in hindsight it kind of makes sense, and seeing the formula play out or seeing the factors, be explained at some point is very special. And there is an interesting thing that happens when you break up into too many categories. Anyways, so what's the bigger point? The bigger point is data compression, or feeling compression into actions is humanity. That is something that should be emulated. Infinite complexity and randomness is actually not, I think, definitive of human beings, because even though there's infinite things going on in our heads, maybe not, maybe not for all of us, even if there could be, infinite factors going in our heads, though you could probably simplify by the top like 5 factors given the top 2 metrics or something like that. Even if there's, infinite complexity, which is these squigglies, completely incomprehensible going on in the brain, it still comes down to doing like 3 things. 1, 2, 3. And because of that, we don't need to worry about how frustratingly complex all of that is. Simulate as many factors as you think are meaningful, but we don't need to match that content-wise. It's quite a chore to do so, and it distances us from how powerful these 3 options could be. And that is one of the core philosophies at the heart of Electra and what makes these emotional numbers make sense to me. I think that there's a compression process that happens. Now, in order to kind of extend the point, there's actually an opposite thing that happens with players. Though one player, I think I would emulate the same way as AIs, they have infinite factors that are mostly incomprehensible, but I think they could be prioritized to be relatively systematized fairly enough. Though that matches the AI character, and their choices may be similar that they can, anticipate. The player is not the player. The player is many players, and not just many players, but many versions of themselves, of all these players. So it's not just, this way, but also all these players, different amounts and with different variety. All these players, player 1, 2, 3, 4, could be playing the game in many different ways. And these different ways don't even line up at all, although some would. And so because of that, now we're kicked back to maybe there is a reason to have more complex decision choices. And that's why I arrived at the emotional, the kind of the sub choice, the micro choice within the macro choice, which I represent in 3D a lot of the times as depth. So if this is, choice 1, there's multiple ways to express yourself, just as there are multiple ways for different players to express themselves. That complexity is matched by this. For AI characters, they're only one person. They're not supposed to change. And that's one of the reasons why I'm against randomness, is because their consistency is an important contrast for the player. One of the cool things about interactive stories, I think, is when the character, truly is the way they are. So there's a limited amount of influence the player can bring to the table. Now, of course, with super wild actions like deciding to be allies or enemies, that feels, quite shocking and, makes a massive difference. But at the social level, assuming you're not going for an assassination attempt, at the emotional level, there's a much more nuanced, subtle influence. You're talking about whether the character likes you a little bit more, dislikes you a little bit more, respects you a little bit more, respects you a little bit less from conversation to conversation. Not these wild hostage negotiation swings, which of course that's realistic, but there's so much chaos in a hostage negotiation because you have limited information about the person, and it's such a wild scenario that I don't know if it's very good for skill-based dialogue selection, even though it's a very exciting scenario. Anyway, so that's kind of, I guess, my justification for, what do you do with the effectively infinite complexity of human beings? Well, look at the end results. The end results of human complexity have to be compressed into actions. And because they have to be compressed into actions, the metrics, the variables that you're looking at can not easily, but they can be systematized meaningfully, and it can represent reality much better than randomness because you can count on that compression. Anyways, have a good one. Hopefully I've given you some interesting ideas, and hopefully I have not led you down the path or made it too exciting to do metrics of metrics. or metrics of metrics of metrics. Though, if you are looking for challenges to convert philosophy into math, that would be one way to do it, I think. All right, have a good one. I'll see you again soon.